Sorry, Chair, I might just do a quick introduction if that's all right. So I want to start firstly by thanking everybody who's been involved with putting this budget together. It's been quite a long process. It's been a real labour of love, but we got there in the end. I want to thank Sukhvinder and the whole finance team who've done a really good job in really difficult circumstances. I want to thank the cabinet members and the members of staff in all of the departments who've gone through their budgets with us line by line to find savings and efficiencies after 13 years of finding savings and efficiencies. So thank you so much for all your work. And it has been, it has been a difficult process. You know, we only got the final figures for the local government finance settlement 2 days before Parliament broke up for Christmas. And it's the 5th year in a row where we've just had a single year financial settlement. So we're having to put these budgets together based largely on assumptions, on guesswork, and on some of the forecasting by officers. I don't know how they do it, but they do a remarkable job. So I wanted to start just by putting my thanks on the record. And we have come up with a budget that I'm very proud of. It's a very tough time to be putting a budget together. You know, inflation is, I think, at the moment at 10.5%. Interest rates are at 3.5%. You know, they've gone up from in less than a year. They went from 0.1 to 3.5%. And the Bank of England is predicting that we're going to be heading into a long recession this year. Now, that's going to have a huge impact on council finances, driving up demand for council services, but also reducing council revenues. So it's a tricky time to be fixing a budget. And also our grants from government has been cut hugely. Back in 2010, it was 164 million. Today, 116 million. You know, that's a cut of 56% in real terms. Now, there aren't many organisations in this country or anywhere else that would be expected to provide the same levels of service that they were doing 13 years ago with less than half of the resources. But we have done that, and indeed we've gone beyond that. We're doing more than we were doing back in 2010. We're very proud that we've been able to abolish home care charges, and we've not had to reintroduce those. We're very proud to have provided free breakfast for school children. We're very proud to have maintained weekly bin collections, to have funded the local law enforcement team, and to have introduced and kept our ethical debt collection policy, which doesn't involve using bailiffs to collect council debt. And our priority this year in these difficult circumstances has been protecting these council services that we're rightly proud of. Now, the economic conditions we know aren't just difficult for councils, they're also very difficult for the people who we're representing, our residents here in Hammersmith and Fulham. You know, prices are going up, bills are going up, food costs more, everything seems to cost more at the moment, and lots of them are really struggling. And we want to do all that we can to protect them. That's why I'm very proud that this year we've been able to introduce nearly £1 million of ring-fenced funding to support people through the cost of living crisis. Now I'll let Sukhvinder talk about the budget in slightly more detail and some of the details of it, but I just wanted to start by putting my thanks on record and going over a few of the key highlights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Ray. Sukhvinder.
Thank you, Councillor Daly. Good evening to all members of the committee. My name is Sukhvinder Kalsi. As the chair has said, I'm the Director of Finance here at LBHF. Can I just begin by saying that the detailed report has been sent out with the papers for you. The presentation that I'm going to go through in the next 10 minutes or so is really a summary and draws out the highlights from that report. It builds on the information that Councillor Ree has already said there, so I'll go through some of that in a bit more detail. So if perhaps the presentation could be shown on the screens, I don't know whether that'll come up in a moment. Just bear with me a second. Okay. Great. So we're going to talk about the budget for 23-24. That's the council's general fund budget. And Danny, in a few moments, will go through the HRA budget, which is specific to the council housing service. I want to talk about 23-24 and the MTFS position for future years. So 3 items that I'll cover in the overall presentation. We shall be really looking at our strategic operating environment, which Councillor Ree has explained, and I'll just add a couple of words to that. Set out in a bit more detail the strategy that we adopted to agree the budget for 23-24. Obviously, that will go to full council in the next 2 or 3 weeks or so. And then to end on a little bit about looking to the future and the MTFS for 24-25. So 10 minutes or so on those matters. Let me perhaps start by saying a few words about the environment that we're facing at the moment, the operating environment. Quite a tough situation overall for all sorts of national reasons and local reasons overall. The slide sets out some of those, and I'd just like to reflect on a couple of those. The economic pressures have been enormous for all local authorities, for public sector bodies, and indeed the nation. Inflation has been more or less more than 10% during most of the year. And interest rates have almost doubled from where they were at the start of the year. All those have been increasing our pressures enormously, have led to increase in demand for our services and the cost of our services overall. It's affected our collection of income as well, as families have tightened their resources. They've spent less on new services with the council. Councillor Ree has indicated that we're still in the annual settlement for the local government grants. We were hoping that the government will move to a 3-year settlement to provide a little bit more certainty. I'm hoping that will come over the next couple of years or so. And there are ongoing reviews of the national framework for business rates together with social care funding. There's a little bit there about some of the local demography issues. We know the changes that are happening within the borough. There are more older people requiring more services overall. We've got some major regeneration programs and services that we're delivering, civic campus amongst those. And we've got a major building homes and communities program, more than 1,200 homes planned over the next few years or so. And there are pressures on some of our services too. And I've highlighted a couple there only, home care and school transport, but there are other services where we are seeing those pressures. So in terms of the strategy for 23-24, as Councillor Ree has indicated, we've tried to ensure that wherever possible, and in fact, we've done that, we've preserved all the frontline services that are valued by residents. The council provides more than 60 or 70 different types of services, and they have been protected in this budget proposals for 23-24. We want to make sure that some of the priorities that the council has already set out are delivered and continue to be a focus. So I've mentioned a couple there. The free home care will continue, and also the weekly collection for waste services. Members of the committee will know that many authorities have moved to collection of waste every 3 weeks, in some cases even longer than that. The council here will be doing its weekly collection of both the domestic and the recycling waste collection. We have been able, as part of the budget proposals, to invest almost £11 million more in services. There's a slide later on that I'll explain a little bit more about that, but obviously the full details are in the report. And finally, we want to make sure that in these turbulent times that the council's finances continue to be strong and resilient. The council has got an excellent track record in managing those positions well, and we want to make sure that that's continued. That's particularly so during the uncertain times that we face now. So there's a summary there of some of the key objectives overall of our budget plans. Just a little bit about some of the key principles that we've set out in the budget for 23-24. We've allowed for pay and prices at 5%. Now, that's quite a bit lower than the inflationary allowances, but we're hoping that with a little bit of good work from officers and members, that we will be able to contain our prices within that, negotiating our contracts more strongly and also looking at pay inflation. The OBR is projecting about 7.5% for next year. So hopefully we will be able to contain that within those. I've said a little bit earlier about the investment in the delivery of the council priorities, and I'll say a couple of words later on about that. The council tax position overall, the government has almost assumed and directed councils to really go for the maximum increase to support the overall delivery of the public services that we will need to do in future years. There are some savings within the budget overall, 2.9. They're mainly efficiencies about how we do things and how we can improve our procurement and our delivery of some of those services.
We're very sorry. I have to ask everybody to leave. Have a coat.
Oh, this is an actual. It's
all.
I believe this isn't a test.
There shouldn't be a test, but this has happened to us before. Would you collect? Thank you very much. Sorry.
Chair, do you wish me to carry on or shall I pause for a moment?
Let's carry on for a moment
Okay.
and whilst all is quiet. Thank you.
Okay. And the budget for next year obviously reflects our borrowing that we'll be undertaking to fund the capital programme and the investment of the council. And I indicated earlier that our borrowing costs have doubled over the past year or so. Where previously we were paying 40,000 for every million, it's now almost 80,000 for every million that's borrowed, including the repayment and the interests that we cover. So if we just go on and then talk a little bit about some of the detail overall. Okay, there's a little bit about the council tax that I've said there. That's a bit of information to indicate to the council that our council tax overall remains one of the lowest nationally at bandy level, £832. It was in 2022-23, probably about £1,000 or so less than the average for the nation overall. A 1% change would add about £8 or so on an annual basis. And 53% of our residents only are expected to pay the full amount. 47% of our residents in some way or another will be exempted or will be protected through the council tax support scheme or will get discounts for being in single person households overall. And I mentioned that point earlier. The government has assumed in its grant settlement for local authorities that local authorities must increase their council tax by the 3% and the 2% for the adult social care precept overall. I just wanted to highlight some of those background issues for members of the committee. Just moving on then onto some of the detail of the actual budget itself. That's a very brief table that summarizes the key changes to the budgets overall. I'm not going to go through all those line by line, but suffice to say that it explains how much we've allowed for pay and price inflation, the additional investment that we put into services, 10.7 million, the savings, the cost of living, almost £1 million that Councillor referred to earlier to support residents through the crisis that we are facing overall financially. We have done some changes to our employee budgets overall. There is a pay award for 22-23 that was above what we'd assumed, but we're funding that partly through introducing a turnover allowance next year. It's only a modest amount, 2%, about 40%, 40 posts overall will be expected to be achieved through natural turnover and through management of recruitment rather than anything else overall. We have been able to generate some significant income from our cash balances, but that's a one-off. Just about the only good thing that I could see from the interest rates position was that if you had some cash balances, you were getting slightly better interest rates, and the council is no different to any individual person. So we'll be generating some extra cash from that next year, which will help support the council's overall budget. So that just gives you a little summary there about some of the key changes within the budget. The details are in the report in full, and obviously we'll discuss and take any questions on that. The next couple of slides talk a little bit about some of the savings proposals and the growth proposals. So again, that's a summary of the full detail that's in there. They are summarized there. The theme there is about how we commission our services better and improve that, and make savings by working with social services, the NHS, amongst other areas, and working with our residents to improve things like the kind of tonnages and the waste that's generated overall. So a modest set of proposals, about 2.9 million in total. The next slide just summarizes the growth proposals that the council has put in. And again, the 10.7, that's the key highlight really, 10.7 in total overall across a broad range of services. Temporary accommodation, the pressure on that, we've put in an extra 1 million almost to support that service. And there's again, all the others that are listed on there. And finally, just a couple of bits really about the reserves position. I mentioned earlier about the need for us to be financially resilient, particularly in these times. It's important that we maintain some good levels of reserves overall. Our total reserves are comparable to other local authorities in London. It's about 26% of our gross expenditure, which is just about the exact level that other local authorities are operating at. And we need to have some minimum general balances, in other words, free resources from between 19 and 25 million is my estimate for that, given the council of this size and the complexity of the services that you're delivering and the major projects that you are working up as a council overall. And that's the current level we're at, about 23 million at the moment for that. We are using some of our reserves in the near future, mainly to deliver some of the programs that we've already agreed as a council. So every 3 years or so, we do an upgrade of our IT infrastructure to make sure that they remain efficient and are well managed. So we'll be spending some resources to deliver that, but they're all funded from those reserves overall. And finally, just a few words about the MTFS and looking forward to the future. I think our operating environment will continue to be difficult over the next year or so at least. Councillor Ree has eloquently explained and described that. The Office for Budget Responsibility is projecting inflation of at least 7.5%, 7.4% during 23 overall. Pay and prices, we're at the moment assuming in our medium-term planning projections will be about 3%. So it's lower, much lower than the kind of OBR forecast, and then subsequently falling to about 2%. There will be the continued demographic pressures and need for services that we've got locally overall. But with all that taken into account, our initial estimates at the moment are that the budget gap for next year will be around 17 million pounds or so, and will increase in future years. But there's a little table in the report that explains that as well. So really, in summary, what I've just shared with you as the committee members tonight is a little bit about our operating background, our budget strategy for 23-24, and I've explained some of the major changes that have happened to the budget, said a little bit about the reserves position and our long-term MTFS position. And this final slide just gives you an indication of the next steps. So the budget discussions are going to all the PAC committees during this week and next week. We'll have the Policy and Oversight Board tomorrow to review the same detailed proposals, and Cabinet, of course, will consider the details on the 6th of February, followed by full council on the 23rd of February. Chair, with that, I'd like to end, and I'm happy to take any questions that members of the committee may have.
Thank you so much, Sukhvinder. Shall I start over here? Do you have any questions? Councillor Siddique?
First question is, what are you doing to improve the repair services for the residents in this budget? What is allocated? I have a couple of more questions as well. I'll go one by one. Is that okay? Okay. How are we making sure the council tenants have a good quality homes? This is the second question. And my third question is, you said we have the reserves, reasonable size of the reserve, but we are going to use the reserves probably this year and next year and following years. If there is any situation like any pandemic came in the past, or any viruses or anything emergency situation come, what are the what type of preparation we have, how we are ready to face for that? And I have more questions. I'll come back.
Thank you, Councillor Siddique. If some of those questions are more relevant after we've spoken about the HRA, then happy to hold them over. Is there anything you'd like to answer now?
Yes, you're absolutely right, Chair. I think the first two questions certainly would be more appropriate for us to consider when we talk about the HRA budget and proposals, which Danny will go through in a moment, but we'll note them and we'll come back to those, Councillor Siddique. On the third point, there will be a separate bit of a discussion about the reserves on the HRA position, but I'll just say a couple of words about the general fund position. I think we were in our reserves at the moment, as I've indicated, are at a reasonable level and match with other local authorities overall. I'm not unduly concerned about that for the moment. Now, should there be any issues and emergencies that arise in the future, I'm fully expecting that nationally the government will support any proposals like they did over the past few months or so, but that's what I would anticipate for that. But we've got adequate levels of reserves for the moment.
Sorry, could I just come in on that one as well? So I think Savinda rightly emphasizes the difference between general reserves and earmarked reserves. So we talked about the spend on IT upgrades. Now, this is something that we knew we were going to have to spend money on every few years to make sure that IT equipment is where it should be. So we put money aside in advance to prepare for that. So there's lots of the reserves are earmarked. You know, we know that we're going to have to spend money on certain things. We think there's a potential risk in certain projects, and so we'll set aside money to cover that. And that's the right and prudent thing to do. But our reserves are, well within what's considered to be a good level. I think that we'd be able to withstand some pretty difficult situations that come up. But Savinda is absolutely right to say if there was another COVID type situation, we would expect to see government stepping in to help all councils. We know that some councils are going into reserves in order to pay for day-to-day spending. We're not doing that here in Hammersmith and Fulham. We're keeping our reserves at a good level, and that's something that we're going to keep an eye on and make sure that we continue doing in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ray. Are there any questions?
Yes, please. Savinda, thank you very much. If I could just start with a couple of questions. On the HRA budget strategy towards domestic rubbish collections, many of our council, well, all of our council estates come under commercial refuse, and the commercial refuse have a different way of collecting rubbish and the frequency of rubbish collections. Will any changes in place there result in more repairs work in terms of blocked rubbish chutes and obstructed bin cupboards and fire hazards in bin cupboards? I say that just because the size of the bins on estates have generally been halved, so they're much smaller bins, but the number of collections hasn't gone up. And so I just assume when we say domestic rubbish that we would include that rubbish, although it does come under a commercial contract.
So we've invested £1.5 million this year in new waste collection. That's keeping all of the services that we currently have, as well as investing in some new ones as well. So we wouldn't expect to see any reduction in service if that was what you're worried about. We should see improvements in certain areas, but generally, in theory, all of the services should be carried out that are currently carried out at the moment.
So just to clarify, so the estate's rubbish won't see any deterioration. It will stay level with the with normal and the general domestic.
Yeah, I can't see any reason why that would be the case. Yeah.
So the next question is your rent calculations. I know there's three rent arrears calculations. There's three different ways I know of calculating rent arrears. And for those who might not be so familiar, if I just explain, you can calculate the rent arrears as being the sum of all the rent due this week minus the amount of money received this week, or we can include the monies received this week, which because some tenants will pay maybe up to 3 months or longer in advance. So that pot of money actually shows more, even though it distorts the figure. The other one is where the DWP or other sources of paying rent decide that they've made an overpayment, or the rent offices decide they've made an under collection. Do we throw that into the general arrears, or is that kept as a separate amount?
Councillor Alexander, I'll try to answer your questions, and I'll bring in Danny as well to some of those. We can go through some of the detail when we got the HRA presentation, but essentially the council accounts for the arrears in the way you described in the first point. So it's the amount due, that's what we've received. Any tenants who've paid their rent in advance is technically money that's owed to them. So we would separate that out and keep that separately. And we'll treat the overpayments and so on from DWP in a similar way as well. Dan, is there anything else you want to add to that?
I think you've answered the councillor's question, Sukhvinder. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could just follow on that. So we have a separate amount of money that's held somewhere in a different account that represents overpayments or payments not due.
All of the actual cash is kept in the same account from the perspective of a bank account, but from an accounting perspective, you're absolutely right. The rent arrears is kept in one particular account, and the prepayments or the rent that's been paid in advance is in a separate account, so that we can account for it separately.
Thank you, Danny. And the relationship with the DWP or our own services, where there's a calculated overpayment that's got to be recovered, does that just go into the general rent? Because sometimes it can be large amounts that nobody can realistically repay for several years. And does that just go into the general arrears, or can that be accounted separately?
It's all accounted for all together, but obviously we have individual reconciliations to explain how much is owing or how much has been overpaid at any one time, and that's generally sorted out at the end of every accounting period, in order to make sure that both us and the DWP are not out of pocket.
Thank you. Just sorry to press. It's only really for clarification. I'm happy with your answer. And it's going to a real example that happened many years ago, where we had about 300 or 400 tenants who, by some DWP calculation, were all deemed to be sort of 2 years of 2 years overpaid in their rent, which suddenly represented to us 100 weeks times 400 tenants in arrears. If that happens or is happening, or where it does happen, how do we account for that so that we don't suddenly think that we've got a failure in arrears collection service, and that we can recognise that there is there's a big problem there?
No, absolutely, and especially in the case that you refer to, where it's a substantial amount. The checks that we carry out, I would ensure that that's overpayment is identified.
Yeah, and are we able to take out tenants, because they can get very worried about those things, so they wouldn't be dealt with in the normal course of people who just have just slipped into arrears? Because I think, you know, the difference in the cases I'm talking about is where suddenly somebody who's always in good faith paid their rent on time and every week. Do we treat them in the same arrears as somebody who's not so careful about getting their rent paid on time?
Well, on the one hand, we treat everybody fairly and equally, but every case has its own peculiarities, if you like. So we would make sure that housing income team manage each rent account in order to support the tenant because ultimately the council wants to support its tenants, and we don't wish people to get into arrears in the first place. Thanks, Martin.
I've been working with the rent income team and our welfare team around managing increases in rents and charges. We're very aware in the current climate, there are quite a few residents who have been just about managing, and with all of the financial pressures around utility bills, food bills, etc., very aware that they will potentially be going into arrears for the first time. And there's a real sensitivity in the rent income team to working with them in the right way, to connecting them with the welfare team, to try to prevent any increasing arrears. And we've been monitoring new arrears cases very carefully so that we can do that.
Thank you, Martin. I've got a couple of other questions, if I may, for Savinda, just on his on his document.
Councillor Alexander, can I come back to you?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Councillor Alford.
Yes, I'm not going to do the paperwork, so I want to.
Councillor Alford, the developer contributions and the SIL contributions are always based on legal agreements and can be difficult to project for the future. The forecasts continue to be reviewed and will be updated, but we're not in a position to be able to give you a longer term forecast, and that's always been the position overall in terms of our financial planning. Let me just clarify that point. The 46 is actually already been received. They are the balances as at the end of March 22. It's the future years that are actually uncertain, which we will update the council and obviously all committees as we know the numbers and they emerge.
Right, if I could then go on to, well, the housing solutions. And I know that we're living in a very volatile housing market, particularly for rents, with a lot of people getting out of it and the rents going up sky high. Is the provision you've made, do you think that's sufficient? And how will other councils be reacting, and will they be putting up their payments?
Councillor Alford, I'll ask Danny to take that question.
There are two provisions which I think you might be referring to in the budget strategy, specifically for housing solutions. We are proposing that we're increasing the budget for inflation by about 900,000, and then we're also proposing that we need to increase the budget in order to help us accommodate the fact that we are experiencing and expecting in the future an increase in temporary accommodation client numbers, and that's for a further 900,000. So overall, it's just over 1.8 million that we're adding into the expenditure budgets, and our estimates and the calculations plus the experience of our housing solutions colleagues on the ground indicate that should be sufficient, although of course like all services in the council there are always risks.
Client volumes increasing and homelessness, again on page 24, paragraph 50, we don't seem to have forecasted any numbers in TA for 2023. We do go on for the increase for 24-25. Is that an oversight, or is that just that we think we've got a stable number, or what is the reason for not having a figure? Page 24.
Yeah, sorry, Yeah, yes, the explanation for there not being any number in the 23-24 column is because the forecast number of clients in temporary accommodation, and indeed that increase in the number of clients in temporary accommodation is already accounted for in that growth item that I was explaining some moments ago.
Right. I think that for the moment is right. I would make one comment that you've printed certain things in the most tiny print. It really is virtually unreadable on your two appendixes, Appendix 1. And I think it's Appendix 2, but the printing is appallingly small.
Councillor Alford, I think those could be printed out landscape rather than portrait, and that might be a little more legible. No, it still looks really small. Would you like to have a look at my laptop?
No, it's right. I've looked at it, but I'm just pointing out that, you know, it is not very helpful, and particularly anybody has any sight problems, you're just making it impossible for them to scrutinise.
Thank you, Councillor Alford.
Chair, can I just offer a comment on that? And yeah, I can appreciate that comment. And I suppose, as with all council materials, if anyone would require anything in a different format, they are more than welcome to contact the governance team to receive that. So there is that option available either through email or print or whatever format people would prefer that in.
Thank you, Councillor Ume.
Our own stuff out, you know.
Equally, a conversation that governance, I'm sure, would be able to assist with.
We live in a digital world. Councillor Morton, do you have any questions at this stage? Okay, lovely.
Can we go back to my question?
Yes, please, Councillor Alexander. You aware that we still have the housing revenue account to go over, and some of your questions might be more relevant to that?
Well, would you like to hear my questions and then
Yes,
direct
completely.
them
I
if
just
it's
wanted you
relevant to go after?
Of course.
It's just a few ones on the strategic. I think it's Savinda. The questions are for on the strategic operating environment. Just a couple of items on there. The stock condition and repair and mold. Is there a schedule that we can refer to on the stock condition? On the building safety requirements, is there a schedule that we can refer to of what is building safety and requirements? The underperforming repairs service you mentioned on page 3, is that charted anywhere or documented anywhere so that we can see and understand what is officially recognised as an underperforming repair service, and what elements of it are that need improving? On one terminology, because it seems to be have different meanings and definitions throughout the whole housing department, whether it's the gas section or whether it's the different repair sections, are where you put meeting the green agenda, the thermal efficiency. Can you tell me what the council's definition of thermal efficiency is, so that it doesn't just get used here and there and misunderstood? And coupled with that, the gas boiler phasing out has already mistakenly been decided at some levels, although that's been resolved. So can we have a much clearer issue on that so that we don't have people telling tenants that they can't have their boiler fixed because it's got to be phased out, which that's been resolved. And I thank everybody for helping resolve that, but it's just getting that clarity in there.
Councillor Alexander, would you like some of these
That's fine.
questions to I'm not sure we've got the right officers with the right preparation to give definitions on items in the housing account. But I can ask
Sorry, I don't expect somebody to give that to me here and now. It's just, does it exist? And at a later date, if somebody points us to where we can get these specific schedules, because if I ask at a lower level outside of this committee, I get all sorts of odds and sods answers and responses that are not very coherent.
Okay, Councillor Alexander, can I just ask Colette Pryor to come to a stand, please, and
It's
see if she
okay.
can answer
I
some
don't
of
want
that
to take
for
the
you.
committee's extra time on this, which is quite detailed.
If you send an email to Richard Buckley on those questions about thermal efficiency, stock condition surveys, he'll be able to help you.
That hasn't worked in the past, so that's why I sort of asked it at this level, so that then it can be clear across the across what we mean.
All right,
Yeah.
lovely. If we can take this,
Okay,
Sure.
maybe if I could send it to John and Mark,
Yeah.
and then they can send it down. Okay.
right,
Thank
lovely,
you.
thank you.
Very happy, Councillor Alexander,
Thank
to
you.
arrange that for you.
Okay, lovely. Now, of course, yes, thank you. If I may ask a question, Sukhvinder, in September, there was a kind of a budget shock for everybody. Interest rates soared, mortgage rates went up, cost of living leapt. I can't see from the report what real effects that's had. I'm guessing it's had some effects. Perhaps you could talk us through what concessions have had to be made for that.
So Councillor Daly, in 22-23, just an example of that, we'd allowed in the budget a pay award of 2%. The pay award eventually ended up at 5% more or less. It was a flat rate increase. That caused us to have additional costs of about 3.8 million in total. We had to fund that from the policy contingencies that we'd set aside in 22-23. So there were pressures financially from that. There were expenditure matters as well on some of our contractual contracts, waste collection, other services. We've had to accommodate that through strong negotiation by minimizing those increases overall and allowing for a little bit of the policy contingencies that we've set aside to deal with that. Now, that's obviously a matter that happened in 22-23. There are some ongoing consequences of that. So the ongoing effects of the pay award for last year, we've accommodated by effectively using what I described earlier as a small 2% turnover allowance in our budgets for the employees overall. So we'll accommodate that in that way. But there are lots of instances elsewhere across the budget where our costs have increased overall, or the pressure on the services has also increased, and our collection of income has reduced somewhat marginally, both on council tax, arrears for rent and so on, and we've had to accommodate that within the overall budgets overall. Now, that's a very general response to your question there as an example for 22-23, but really some of those effects will go on into 23-24, which is what this budget was about.
And this allows for more sort of similar shocks over the next year or
Which
two.
is, I'd just like to emphasize a point that Councillor Ree said earlier. So the budget proposals that we put forward are without us using any reserves to balance the budget overall, and will maintain our policy contingencies that we've always had for those extraordinary circumstances should they arise during the year.
Lovely, thank you. Can I ask Councillor Ree?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So there were a huge amount of turmoil this September caused by the mini budget. We saw markets were in disarray. People were worried about losing their pensions. I think the big impact of that has been the increased cost of borrowing. Now, I was going to say luckily, but it's not luckily. It's because we've managed our finances very prudently. We've not needed to make any additional in-year borrowing, but other councils, other organisations that are having to borrow money on the markets, from Public Works Loans Board, from high street banks, or whoever, that has shot up as a result. You know, and that means that organisations aren't able to get the same amount of money, that they're paying more in interest, and so they're not able to invest as much. I'd say that's been the biggest impact of the mini budget and the turmoil that resulted from that. Also, I'd also just say that because of the negative impact it had on the wider economy, that means that demand for council services increases, people maybe if they get laid off from their jobs, they all of a sudden they need to rely on council services. If they don't have the same amount of money coming in that they previously did, they might have to come and ask us for support. They might need to have a bit of a break in paying council tax or this sort of thing. So it will have an impact on our revenue. It'll also have a big impact on the amount that we're spending on council services as well, because demand will go up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And can I ask members, are there any more questions specifically on the medium-term financial strategy before we move on to talking specifically about housing? Are there any more medium-term questions?
May I suggest, if we can ask the question in the end, probably is mix and match, and they will know who's going to answer.
Sure.
We have a lot of questions,
Sure,
probably we'll wait until the end.
All right, lovely.
Sure.
Thank you. In which case, can we please move on to the housing revenue account budget?
Thank you, Chair. So the housing revenue account budget presentation, Danny will lead on that. There's a set of slides that will go through and explain the proposals for 23-24, much in the same style as this one. It'll explain the strategic operating environment and some of the detailed matters relating to that budget. So perhaps I'll defer to Danny to do that.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Speyer, that's the wrong presentation. The one that should be on display is the one that's entitled Housing
There is a second
Revenue
presentation.
Account.
Wasn't
It was included with the papers. I can email it over to you. Fair. Yeah.
Chair, sorry, as Danny is doing that, so they are the slides that went out with your papers. So I do apologize for the little mix up there, but we'll just bring up those slides and we'll
No,
go through
thank you.
those.
I'm just wondering, whilst we're waiting for that, rather than kind of getting to the end of the meeting and looking at what the recommendations might be from that first section, whilst we're waiting for that, why don't we kind of have a conversation about those recommendations? The recommendations that are being put forward are one, that the Policy and Accountability Committee considers the budget proposals and makes recommendations to Cabinet as appropriate. Are we agreed? And that the PAC considers the proposed changes to fees and charges and make recommendations as appropriate.
I don't think it's going to be very much discussed about fees and charges.
Okay, would you have some questions about fees and charges in particular?
Well,
Councillor Orford?
yes, I mean, what exactly fees and charges are going up?
I think that in Sukhvinder's presentation, he was talking about, Sukhvinder, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, we'll do that, but I'd like to make a general observation on the fees and charges approach that the council is adopting. So there is a little section of the report, but I'll just summarize what's in there. So will you just dig the page for me? Councillor Alford, just bear with me a second. I'll answer the question. I'll refer to that page, but it's in the committee report. But the council's policy is that all fees and charges relating to adult social care, children's services, and housing will be frozen. Okay. On an exceptional basis, fees will go up in line with inflation for those services that are commercially based. Okay, so that's the general approach that the council is taking, and there were some exceptions to that as well.
15, thank you.
So hopefully that's given the context about the approach that the council is taking to the fees and charges.
Right. That's,
Paragraph 7, Councillor Orford.
yeah, no, I've got it.
Lovely.
I can actually read. But I was just saying, you haven't actually sort of, normally you detail a bit more what the charges are. I mean, I fully understand adult social care, children's services. But what fees are you talking about in housing?
We're about to get to housing.
Well,
the detail of the housing account.
So there's no point in agreeing that bit of fees of housing
Okay.
if we haven't got to it.
I'm only asking for agreement over the medium-term financial, so the broader strategy rather than just specifically the housing strategy. We get to look at the wider strategy and we get to agree that, and then we can move on to the housing strategy. Thank you. I see that we've got the presentation, so shall we push on and look at that HRA? Thank you. Thanks, Danny.
Great. I think everybody already knows who I am. Just to explain, this evening I'm going to present an overview of the budget and renting array for the next financial year, which begins in April. I'll take us through the current financial and strategic operating environment for the council's housing service. I will give you an overview of the HRA budget and also provide a brief insight into the capital programme and provide some key metrics. And of course, there'll be time for questions and discussion at the end. Could I have the next slide, please? So the current strategic service and financial operating environment for the council's housing service is extremely challenging. There are increasing demands for social and affordable housing, an urgent need to address long-term underinvestment in the existing housing stock. The regulator rightly requires improvements in building safety. We have greater demands for engagement with our tenants and increased expectations for improvements in services. And we are also finding a path to net zero. Housing actually accounts for 75% of the council's CO2 emissions. And of course, we're turning around the performance of the repairs service. On the finance side, the ongoing national economic climate of high inflation and high interest rates results for us in increases in the cost of service delivery, increased pressure on rent collection on household incomes, increased pressure on rent collection as household incomes reduce. It makes our investment plans more expensive. It makes borrowing to fund those plans more expensive, and it increases the demand for the housing service. And on top of all of that, government has placed a cap on rent increases, whilst providing no additional funding to make up that gap. Could I have the next slide, please? In the face of these considerable challenges, our financial strategy therefore aims to achieve 4 key outcomes: ensuring that our tenants receive high quality housing services, delivering key housing priorities, including improving the condition of our tenants' homes, as well as developing new homes, enabling immediate issues such as damp and mold and disrepair to be quickly and effectively dealt with, and also making certain that the HRA continues to be well managed financially, so that we can provide you with the best housing service possible. Next slide, please. So we've made a number of assumptions in preparing the budget for next year. This includes providing for pay inflation of 5% on the assumption that inflation continues to remain at a stubbornly high rate next year. We have a range of housing management and repairs and maintenance contracts, of course. Many of those compel us to increase contract payments in line with CPI. That's the consumer price inflation. However, we have other contracts where through negotiation, it's been possible to agree lower rates of inflation, and that's allowed us to limit the average increase overall to around 7%. We're currently losing some rental income as every housing authority experiences, due to void properties. But we have a voids reduction plan that we've put in place, which aims to reduce or to return average void levels to around 2% of our stock next year. We've got a more than adequate provision for bad debt in the HRA. We've also had to increase our assumptions about the cost of debt next year. As has already been discussed earlier, interest rates have increased. And on rents, we're proposing a rent increase of 4.4% from April 2023 for both general needs and sheltered housing tenants. That's equivalent on average to an increase of £5.20 per week. And that is within the maximum increase that the government has permitted for next year of 7%. It's also lower than 11.1%, which is the maximum rent increase that would have applied had government not intervened and placed that 7% cap on rent increases. The vast majority of other local housing authorities, from the intelligence that we've been able to gather, are expected to increase rents by 7%. Could you turn to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this slide sets out the budget for next year and the changes from this year. You'll see from the rents figures at the top of the slide that we're going to generate an additional £5.5 million in income next year. And that's from the combined full year effect of the November rent increase plus the additional 4.4% increase for next year. We also, along with rental income, we generate service charges income, and that's expected to increase by about £3.5 million next year. And again, that's from that combined full year effect of the November service charge increase plus an additional increase to bring our costs into line with the cost of providing those communal services for next year. On the expenditure side, we have other significant changes, such as an increase in our voids and repairs costs of 1.4 million. That relates mainly to growth in the budget for changes in the various contracts that we've got, plus pay inflation also. With housing management, we've got an increase of 1.7 million, and that mainly relates to the cost of decanting residents into temporary accommodation, additional customer service resourcing, an annual visits team, as well as the necessary uplifts on pay and contract inflation. You'll spot there that there's a quite large increase in capital charges of around £3 million. That's a result of the combined effect of increases in interest rates, but also increases in the amount of borrowing that we're planning to undertake in order to fund the capital investment needed to make the council homes safe and compliant. Other figures on that page that are worth pointing out is that we've got some pipeline savings of 1.1 million, which are what we expect to deliver via the housing transformation programme. And I think overall, if you look at the second line from the bottom of the slide, the changes that we have made in the budget between this year and next year are favourable, as they have addressed 2.6 million of the current structural of the current structural deficit, reducing it from 4.1 million this year to 1.4 million next year. Could you turn to the next slide, please? I won't go through all the main changes again, but this slide is just a slightly alternative presentation that sets out the major movements between this year and next year. Again, you've got pay inflation of 5% on a net staffing cost of around £20 million. Contractual inflation includes our repairs and maintenance contracts, housing management, as I've already mentioned, but also things like estate services contracts, such as grounds maintenance and our caretaking contracts. We've got permanent growth of 1.2 million, which includes changes to contracts, also additional resource to fund an annual visits team and an increase in loss of income from void properties. I've spoken about the increase in interest rates. So overall, despite the need for significant inflationary and interest rate increases, which are outside of our control, the steps taken this year have helped to improve the structural deficit by 2.6 million and bolster the financial resilience of the HRA. Could I have the next slide? Thank you. To provide you with a bit of further context regarding the financial position, we currently have £16 million in the HRA general reserve. After the budgeted drawdown for this year of £4 million and assuming an overspend this year of 1.2 million, we will have 10 million in our reserves for next year. So in addition to the reduced structural budget deficit for 23-24 of 1.4 million, we're also planning for some temporary actions which will cost about 2.2 million. They'll support improvements in customer services, help us to pay for disrepairs, help us to remove and eliminate our damp and mold issues, also help us to cover the cost of having to decant some tenants into temporary accommodation. So overall, reserves will remain substantial at 6.7 million to take us into the medium term. Next slide, please. This just sets out the housing capital investment plans over a 5-year period. It includes not just the asset management and compliance program, which relates to improvements to our tenants' homes, and which will cost just over 200 million over the next 5 years. But it also brings in the net zero plans to decarbonise our homes and the new build development programme. So taken together, that's nearly £500 million of capital investment over a 5-year period. At the bottom of the slide there, that just sets out the sources of the funding. I spoke about extra borrowing earlier on. 2 more slides. These key metrics just help you to give some context and perhaps some comfort to the financial challenges that we're facing. Our tenants' homes account for one of the biggest numbers on the council's balance sheet. They are valued at around 1.5 billion billion under the lower social housing valuation, but at an open market value, that would increase to 6 billion. That gives an average valuation of £125,000 for each home, but on the open market, that would be 4 times that. The current level of debt that we have in the HRA is 219 million, which is equivalent to about £18,000 per home, and that's less than half the debt per property that you'd expect to find among other social housing registered providers. The point is that there is room for the additional extra borrowing, so our plans to increase the amount of the amount of debt per property are supportable. And the last point on that slide, I've already mentioned that rent arrears are more than adequately provided for. One more slide, just to, there isn't one more slide. Well, then in that case, I will just explain that we'll be taking an updated report to Cabinet to take account of any comments from the PAC this evening, and that report is scheduled to go for approval at Cabinet on the 6th of February. I will hand back to the chair now to take questions.
Thank you so much, Danny. Could we turn the presentation off so that anybody watching can, thank you. Lovely. Can I, Councillor Morton has a couple of questions, but can I just ask one up front, please? Danny, you were talking about the financial resilience of the HRA, and you talked specifically about a 7% cap that would have been 11.1%. Now, I'm aware that the cap was, until recently, I think a couple of years ago, it was -1%. And I wondered how you anticipate and mitigate in long range planning rather than like long-term planning rather than mid-term planning. And you know, the balance, that the need to be a responsible landlord and on behalf of residents.
That's a very good question. I will try and answer that, and I will pass to Savinder if he wants to add anything else. We have a long-term financial planning process in the HRA, and we update that annually. Our current long-term financial plan allows for a sustainable HRA over the long term. It is a challenge to produce long-term forecasts, especially if the goalposts are constantly changing. So yes, we had a 4-year period, you're absolutely right, in which we were compelled to reduce our rents by 1% every year for 4 years between, well, starting in 2016. That's obviously had an impact. I think it took about £17 million in total from our HRA. So that's obviously money that could otherwise have been spent on improving the condition of our homes. And since then, the expectation has been that under the rent regulations, we'll be able to increase our rent by CPI plus an additional percent until 24-25. And then it's uncertain what government policy will be after that. So we've taken a prudent approach, and we've forecast our rents in the long term on the basis of CPI. CPI increases. So on that basis, that allows us to make sure that we I suppose cut our cloth according to how much money we expect to be coming in to the HRA. So it's a difficult process, and I can feel that Savinda wants to add a few words, so I will hand over to Savinda.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Sorry, I didn't think I'd made it that obvious, but Councillor Daly and cabinet members, could I just and also members of the committee, I've been reflecting much about what national rent policy has been over the past decade or so, and I've been somewhat confused by it all. So from 2012 to 16 or so, it was RPI plus 0.5%. Then subsequently, as you've said, Councillor Daly, there was that reduction of -1% for 4 years. When that finished, then we talked about CPI +1. And as Danny has said, that was only really intended to be to 24-25. And there's no indication at all for us, for our planning terms, what the future policies on the rent levels might be. Now, Danny has eloquently explained the impact of the -1% and the reduction in the resources overall. I can remember local authorities during that period lobbying extensively that actually that amount should be compensated to local authorities through some sort of national grant to protect the infrastructure of all council housing and to continue the provision of services. Councillor Ree and us are making much the same comments with the current policies, because at the moment, Danny has explained, our inflationary pressures are 11-12% on our budgets, and yet we're going to be increasing our rents by 4.4%. That gap really ought to be met somehow through some national resources, is my impartial and suggested option that I've offered always to colleagues at national government departments, but a difficult position overall.
Thank you very much. So I suppose there's a balance. If we put it up 7%, then we'd be expecting more people to fall into arrears and need more help. I understand. Thank you. Councillor Morton.
Dana, thank you for that. Almost the first line on your presentation was an anticipation of increased demand for social and affordable housing. Do you have any figures as to the split there? Because the two are obviously not the same, and frequently what's described as affordable to the general public isn't affordable in this part of London. Certainly there's a demand for social housing. I don't know whether you were able to put any numbers to that, and also the type of social housing, because I've noticed over the last 6 years an increased demand for 3 and 4 bedroom family accommodation, whereas the planning applications seem to be largely for 1 and 2 bedroom homes. So can you define it more closely?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting comment and question, Councillor Morton, because our role is to help people in housing need, And what we're actually seeing is increase in demand for housing, be it affordable social housing and other affordable tenures such as shared ownership. We're also seeing increase in people presenting as homeless, and our this is on the general funded part of the budget in terms of private sector leasing and temporary accommodation. So that's increasing pressure for us now, and we envisage that increase in moving forward. But as a council, we've got ambition, aspiration to provide more housing. So we've got an ambitious development programme, which we'll tell you more about at the next PAC meeting in March. So, and you're absolutely right, you know, particular demands for 3 or 4 bedroom family housing, which isn't the cheapest property types to develop. I think you've heard this evening that it's pretty much funded through capital borrowing, and you've heard that the rates of borrowing have gone up substantially. So the more we invest in new build, and the more we invest in improving our existing housing stock, will have an impact on borrowing, which we pay the interest on through the housing revenue account. So you'll see the increased cost coming in revenue terms as well.
Just if I may, I don't have all the figures to hand, but we believe there's around 3,000 people waiting for council housing in the borough. It's about a 10-year wait, because you did ask specifically about social housing. And we also work with alternative providers, you know, social landlords, etc., to ensure, you know, there's a raft of different types of provision in the borough to best meet that demand, because, you know, it is very high, as you say.
Yeah, Debbie, could we please just minute that Mark would like to bring the new build development plans to the next PAC? Thanks. Yeah, Councillor Morton, please.
Yes, I see you've got I think 2.2 million in there for damp and mould. There's been a lot of adverse publicity about the effects of mould. Many of the council properties, particularly in the blocks of flats as of Lytton and some of the estates, are very, very badly affected by this. And I think as councillors are all concerned that this might start to reflect on us as an administration. Is 2.2 million enough, or do you need to increase that in view of the increased publicity and concern over damp and mould?
Do you want to touch on the finance and I'll come on to damp and mould?
I think detailed work is underway to make a thorough assessment of the level of the issues of damp and mould, and colleagues are doing that. We've set aside some of that cash for that there, and clearly we have to keep the position under review. And if we need to spend more resources on that, then we will have to identify that within the HRA to deal with that overall. But it is an important health matter that the council needs to progress and resolve.
So I'm happy to offer a full explanation about what we're doing about damp and mould, if that'd be helpful, Councillor Martin.
Yeah. So I was just highlighting it as a concern, because I know some of the conditions people are living in is absolutely dreadful. My final comment was on potential defaults. I've had a lot of correspondence from leaseholders in the council blocks who've suddenly been presented with substantial bills between 20 and 30,000 pounds, which, with the recent increase in inflation, they are really struggling to pay, and have asked for additional time. Now, I know we are doing what we can to help them as much as we can, but do we have any additional provision in the event that they cannot pay, or can we offer any extended terms for them?
Sorry, I can come in on this one if that's helpful. So I completely understand the problem. In my ward, we've got similar issues where we're carrying out work on Becklow Gardens estate. Obviously, for the leaseholders, that means they get sent a letter saying they're going to be expected to pay it. And yeah, as you rightly say, at the moment when times are very tough, the last thing people want is a big number coming through the post, being told they need to pay it. We are allowing extra flexibility in terms of repaying that. That might be over a longer period. It might be a sort of payment holiday for while times are particularly difficult. But yeah, it's not the case that they need to sort of cough up the money straight away. You know, there are flexible options, and officers are very much highlighting that to the people who are coming forward with these bills.
Councillor Morton, that was the point I was just checking with my colleagues, and Councillor Ree has effectively answered it. Yes, there will be options and extended payment arrangements that are offered to the leaseholders to allow that to be accommodated over a longer period of time.
Thank you, Councillor Morton. Councillor Orford.
Yes, first of all, I'd like to make a point. I have been asking about this year's HRA to have an update on it, and this has been refused. We have now got the forthcoming HRA. I have to say I've got the previous report from last year, and the figures don't correlate. So it would have been helpful if there had been an updated report so we could actually have monitored about what was happening with the HRA. Also, you're setting it out in a completely different setup, so making sure you've actually double checked it takes time, but never mind. I am concerned. I'm concerned about quite a few things. As I have raised the matter, you had to make 3.8 million savings last year. I realise it wasn't savings you made. You actually just increased the charges. You're now saying this year you're going to do the rent increase to begin with of 4.4%. Is there going to be in the following 6 months another 4.4% raise? And nothing has been said about how much the service charges are going to be. And they went up astronomically in November. And I've got a few more questions after that.
Sorry, I can answer that if you like. So in terms of service charges, the policy on service charges is that residents should be charged a cost that covers the cost of providing the service. Now, that's always been the case. That hasn't changed. All that's changed is that we've reviewed how much it actually costs to provide these things. Now, it's not fair for us to be in a position where we're asking council tenants to subsidise services that some people receive and some don't. So the updated service charges just reflect the actual cost that it costs to provide these services. In terms of the rent, when we're setting rent levels, we consider a whole range of things, including the cost of living. You know, we talked earlier about how people's bills are going up, how people are paying more for food, how prices in general are rising, and we don't want people to have to pay more than they need to. We've set this budget and we've looked at what it is we need in order to make sure we have a sustainable budget. And we've arrived at the figure 4.4%. We think that's a good figure. We don't want to put rents up unnecessarily higher than they need to be. And so that's why it comes to the figure. No, we don't think we're going to need to put rents up any higher because we think that this is a well thought out budget. It's a sustainable budget. It's got contingencies in, and there are efficiencies being made within the department. So no, we think this is going to be the figure for the year.
I come back with respect. That was roughly what was said last year, and I appreciate you doing your utmost, but I am concerned, and I would like perhaps a somewhat stronger statement from you that the residents and particularly service charge people are not suddenly going to find 6 months hence, oops, we haven't quite calculated it right, we're going to put it up for you again. And with regard to the service charges, I would suggest you had a really good look at them, because you're charging people who live in houses for door entries when they don't have them. And you're doing a lot of things that actually people don't have, but they're being charged for them. And I don't know whether you're aware of that, but
Yeah, well, obviously, people seeing the new charges are, reassessing what it is that they're actually getting. People have come to us to tell us that they're being charged for services that they're not using or that they don't get. And in those cases, we don't charge them. Right? That's well, no. If someone comes to us and says that they're being charged for a service that they don't have, then we're not going to charge them for it. You want a strong statement? Yeah, absolutely. Read my lips. We will not be putting rents up.
Good. That's what I would like to. Then if I could.
Councillor Orford, I think Martin would like to answer your question as well.
Just on that, we took a lot of time and care to get the revised charges right, and it was a big exercise. We got about 1,200 calls, a number of them were repeat calls, and we had 122 challenges, people saying, I'm not happy about my charge. And that was an opportunity to identify and fix a moderate level of errors that that picked up on. And obviously, if we charge somebody incorrectly, we then ask the question, is there anybody else in the same situation? And we fixed their bills as well. We were led by terms and conditions in leasehold agreements and more general terms in tenants agreements. And we sought specialist legal advice and generally went with the line that is throughout the sector. And there are some homes on ground floors where it is right, and the precedent has been set that they do have to pay a contribution for some of the services such as door entry and lift entry access, because they do benefit from access to the building. They benefit because it keeps noise and so forth down. So although on the face of it, we understood why some tenants were saying, hold on a second here, why are we being charged for this? We were very thorough and robust in how we managed it.
It's very interesting, and thank you. Except I do find it a little strange that people who live in houses are also being charged for door entry when there's single occupancy. But if I could go on to another question, and that is the void rent loss. What is the current position on the void rent loss? How is it? I mean, you've said to me it's going to improve, but what is the current position?
When you're short of money to balance your budget, you kind of look at all the areas where and you go through them and say, could we make a difference? Could we improve it? And we looked at void rent loss. I think it was in October, maybe early November, and we thought, yeah, we can improve. We can turn around our vacant properties when they fall, when people terminate tenancy, hand the keys back. We can repair and prepare them and re-let them quicker. We also looked in the detail about the void properties that were on our books, why they were void. Some of these properties needed decisions making on whether to retain them, sell them, improve them. Including one or two properties in sheltered accommodation. So we decided that rather than generalize and sort of prepare reports that talked about generic or general numbers of voids, we would go down and categorize. These have been empty for these reasons. These have been empty for those reasons. These have been empty because they need major investment in them. And we have targeted actions against each category of void, if you like. We presented that to Cabinet Member for Housing. We presented that to our strategic leadership team, and nobody's happy at the current number of voids we've got. It was about I'm just looking around to see if anybody can remember, probably about 340 odd voids, which was about 2.5, 2.6%. we set out all the actions against all the categories of voids, and we came to the conclusion that we projected where we might be at the end of December, at the end of Q3, and then at the end of Q4. So this month we will be doing a short report on the progress that we've made since October. So from October to the end of December, and compare that with where we, I say projected, it was more than a guess. It was based on, you know, agreed, targeted management actions. So if some of those actions haven't come to fruition, the review will look at why and why not, and then we'll look at what our revised projection will be for the 31st of March, and whether we can accelerate the actions to improve the position.
Is it possible that a report could be brought to this PAC so we could actually see what's happening with voids? Because
I'm more than happy to provide a summary of that report and what I've just taken you through. But the journey is to get us to 2% of housing stock void rather than 2.5%. And we have ambition to make 2% the absolute maximum. So actually, as we go through the coming financial year and beyond, you know, we're forever reducing the number of vacant properties that we've got in our housing stock. I have to say that with that ambition comes difficult decisions. You know, we might be coming back to members and saying, we really think you ought to think about selling these 10 or 20 units because they've been empty for a long time. It's going to cost us, you know, hundreds of thousands to bring them up to a relatable standard. And you know, we could get 1.2 million in value if we sold them all. You know, so there'll be some challenging conversations around how we quarter by quarter reduce the number of voids from about 340, 350 down into the 200s and less than 2% of our housing stock, and how we see that as a long-term aim, but actually we've already made progress, and what we want to see is progress quarter on quarter on quarter.
very beneficial if it could be brought back for scrutiny to this PAC.
Thank you, Councillor Alford. We have spoken about voids at, I think, all of the meetings. In fact, we've had some conversations about voids being turned around faster and used for people in temporary accommodation, and to relieve that side of the. I think we're covering voids quite well in the meetings as we go, rather than having it as a single item.
It would be much better if we had a regular, just a small item, just like we were supposed to have regular updates on repairs, of which we're not getting, you know,
I think we've brought repairs to every PAC since we
Chair?
made that commitment.
I think it's very helpful feedback, and let's take a note of that and take it on board for future PACs. But as you rightly say, you're right. We have been making these discussions at PAC meetings, and I'm sure you will take that on board for future PAC agendas.
Perhaps if we could also have a review of where the housing revenue account is actually going mid-term, rather than waiting once a year to discover what has actually happened to it.
Thank you, Councillor Alford. Any
Councillor Daly,
questions?
sorry, through you, if I could just interrupt for a second, could I just clarify a couple of points for the committee, please?
Yes, please
For
do.
the last point that Councillor Alford has said, can I assure committee that the finances of the council are under rigorous and regular scrutiny. There are regular reports that are presented to Cabinet on the revenue budget position, including the HRE. And the next report will be presented in the next couple of months or so. So that does cover the HRE as well. On the point about the presentation, I'd like to assure the committee as well that the budget numbers for 22-23 are exactly as per approved last year. They're just presented in a slightly different way. I'm all for transparency and better understanding. It certainly helped my understanding. So we presented the HRA in a slightly different grouping, but the numbers are exactly the same. If members don't like that particular methodology, well, I can always revert back to the old one. But that was my my suggestion on that one.
Thank you. Thank you for clearing that up, Sukhinder.
Chair, could I just refer you back to the minutes from our previous meeting, and there we did discuss the voids, and in particular how we were going to deal with them. There was an outstanding action on, I think, to Richard Buckley, and he said he'd undertake to circulate after the meeting information on the building specifications adopted by HF, which was of a high standard. He highlighted key aspects of the void reduction plan. But I don't know if anybody else has. I haven't received anything on that.
Yeah. We'll chase up for you, Councillor Alexander and other members.
Thank you. Take that as an action. Thank you, Councillor Alexander. Action on action completely. Councillor Sadiq, do you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to say thank you to Councillor Ree and Councillor Ume, and then I think the Danny is now present, John, Mark, Sukhinder and Daniel Martins, everyone for your hard work and your teams. But I have a short questions, probably I'm not sure who's relevant to, they can answer anyone who is relevant to, is just a short question. In your slide where you said proposed HRA budget 2023 to 24, I will just say, you don't need to put up if you can see on your computer. There's a pipeline savings 1.1 million. Can I ask what is the pipeline saving is from the rent increase?
I can try and answer that. Yes. So the rent increase is not included in the pipeline saving. The budget, the impact on the budget in terms of the rent increase is on the top line of that slide, the one that refers to the gross rental income, where we're generating an extra 5.5 million. The pipeline savings have a number of items in there in terms of it in terms of mostly as I mentioned earlier, I think when I was giving the presentation, I explained that part of that pipeline saving was expected to come from the results of the housing transformation programme. And there are a few other smaller savings in there also. So I hope that answers your question, Councillor.
Hello. I look after the housing transformation programme. So we have a fully structured programme in train, which is about consolidating and simplifying our housing management structure, supporting it with online service delivery, and also, as soon as we can, reducing costs associated with service failure, and key to that is what we're doing with repairs. It is going to be a challenge to find the 1.1 within the next financial year, but we're determined to do everything that we can to realise savings as quickly as possible. The main focus of these savings is savings on the pay bill. So a reduction in headcount, starting obviously with management. So the programme is in train. We are looking at all options to deliver savings as quickly as possible, but we want to do it in a safe way so that we carry on delivering a high quality, a better customer experience.
So if I understand correctly, is the potential figure we can achieve, hopefully.
That is what we are aspiring to do, but it is not without risk. We can definitely deliver that level of saving, but there is an issue around the timing of it, so it's done safely. We are working on it, and we can provide updates on where where we stand with progress.
And if I could just add, I mean, there's an absolute commitment to service quality. Okay, so we must avoid wherever possible tensions between saving and service quality, because we want to do the best for our residents.
Thank you. I understand today we are talking about the financial strategy and the housing budget. I'll try to be within my questions, not out of the, coming to the residents. What are the additional support is available for the, the people who are struggling to pay increased rent?
Yeah, so just over half of our tenants are in receipt of benefits, and our rent income team and welfare team work hand in glove with our benefits service. That includes discretionary housing payments for people who don't get all of their rent covered. Then we also have two streams of hardship funding as well. One is an emergency payment for people who just do not have the means to pay for absolute essentials, which is a one-off payment. We've also introduced a hardship arrangement for those that are struggling to deal with rent and service charge increases. On average, about 50% of the mid-year increase for those that came forward for that, and where it was approved, about 50% of the increase was catered for through that hardship provision between its introduction and the end of March. And we're reviewing those provisions in light of the changes that are going to happen from 1st of April. So we have comparatively a good offer of support for those tenants that are really struggling. And obviously, it's not just about providing cash, it's also about helping them manage their money, manage their debt, maximize benefits, and also think about where it's possible, pathways to better income through training and work as well, which is part of what we do.
Thank you. My next question is.
Sorry, Councillor, could I just clarify the numbers? So what Martin has said is absolutely right. A sum of £250,000 was specifically set up last year as part of the proposals to help residents with that. And we will carry those resources forward into future years if they are not fully utilised, but we will set aside more resources for that.
Thank you, Ms. Gurinder. Again, residents, next question. Residents are hit by high sky bills due to the current situations, obviously. How the HRA is taking account of the cost of living crisis?
So obviously the management of rent and rent arrears and welfare, everything that I've talked about is key, but the council also has a wider cost of living service offer. It's invested in a dedicated team to support that. We're referring into that service. When you go onto the website now, you'll see a banner right at the front, which sets out all the elements of that provision. So we are working closely with colleagues across the council. Economy is leading on the development of financial inclusion services, making sure that what we've already got online is publicised better, access and take up is better. And we're also looking to innovate and develop the practical support that we can provide for those that are really struggling with the current cost of living pressures.
Again, the follow-up question.
Yeah. So, sorry, could I just come in on that as well, Chair? Absolutely, what Martin said is absolutely right. Specifically on the HRA, if I could just go back to some of the issues that we touched on earlier. Under the government's proposals, we are able to put rents up by 7%. We've chosen not to do that because of the cost of living. The cost of living runs like a stick of rock through everything that we're doing at the moment in the council. We are determined that all charges, all fees, all services should be at a level that don't disadvantage people. And where anybody is struggling, if anyone is suffering, then they should come to the council and ask what support is available, and we'll do our best to help.
Next question is again for the rent increase, like in private sector and housing association, do you have any comparison?
I can answer that. From the information that we've had from the London boroughs and the information that we've had from registered providers, universally, everybody's going with a 7% increase overall is our information. Obviously, that will become self-evident over the next couple of weeks as councils publish their details through the cabinet reports, but that's what councils are planning to do.
Sorry, can I ask a quick question? Does that include housing associations?
It does indeed. The rent policy applies to housing associations as well, and that's our information too, that they will be increasing it by that level too.
So on behalf of kind of residents in housing association properties in Hammersmith and Fulham, we are anticipating that the rent increase will be around 7%. Okay, thank you.
So, and just, you asked about the private sector, Rightmove shows to October 22 in the year previous. In Greater London, private sector rents going up by about 16%, 16.
After the government's cap system is gone to, like Councillor Ree said, is 7%, is it?
Well, that only applies for social housing. So in the private sector, landlords can put rents up by as much as they like, and as John says, the average is around 16%. So that really does show the difference between the increase for council tenants and for people in the private rented sector. So obviously we have a lot of people living in the private rented sector in this borough as well. As I mentioned in the last item, we've set aside nearly £1 million to help people with the cost of living crisis. One of the things that I'm sure we'll be looking at is whether there are any solutions that we can put forward to help people living in the private rented sector.
Chair, can I just add on that
few more
point?
questions.
Sorry, Councillor. I just wanted to add on that point, specifically with regards to housing association, the work that's being done to work in partnership with them to ensure that they're providing provisions for residents in light of the proposed rent increase to 7%, and also thinking about the offering that this administration can offer to residents as well through the provisions already described by Councillor Ree as well as Martin. So offering that financial assistance where residents are facing difficulty, whether they are a council home or within a housing association too.
Thank you, Councillor
I
Limay.
understand.
Councillor Siddiq, would you like to ask your questions and ask the officers just take notes, and then they can come back with all of the answers?
Oh, that's fine, but I have just two more questions. If that.
All right, lovely. Yeah.
Just two more. I'll be short. Deficit is a 4.1 2022-23. Use reserved in 2022-23 is 4.1. And this year, in 2022-23 will be 1.4. This is the figures on the table. And are you satisfied, again, is that there is no risk of default like other few councils regarding reserves?
Councillor Siddiqui, the HRA budget proposals that the committee is considering today have been prepared on a very strong, realistic basis overall. I'm comfortable that the overall reserves that the council will have on the HRA are at a reasonable level. Certainly when I compare them to other local authorities on the HRA or where I've worked previously, the balances have been much lower. So overall, I think the set of proposals will maintain the financial resilience of the HRA for the medium term in the future.
Sorry, the last question. What are we doing to improve the repair services for the residents and this budget?
I'll take that for my chair. We're doing a lot to improve the repair service, and we absolutely recognise it's not where we'd like it to be yet. Okay, but there have been some significant improvements over the last year, notably bringing down the number of outstanding repairs needed across the borough quite substantially by about 30%. Okay, that's not the only indicator. There are others that have moved in a positive direction. Like I say, we are very clear and very transparent that there's more to be done. So at the start of this, I suppose, we have the 600 million investment program in our stock. There's about 40 to 50 million expected spent this financial year, another 40 to 50 in the next financial year, which should start to bring down the number of repairs demanded from the service. Okay. We work closely with our large contractors, Morgan Sindall and Mears, managing them to address operational issues and carrying out repairs. We've also brought on some medium-sized contractors to increase capacity in the borough, and we're looking at other ways to increase capacity in the repairs service. Okay. And then there's various management tools, information holdings, how we deal with complaints, alignment of different teams. So we're looking at this holistically about a service and having a culture of more confidence, more resident orientated service too. So there's a number of different ways which we're approaching this problem. Like I said, there has been progress, but there's still more to do. And in particular, say on damp and mold, which is an issue and has been mentioned a couple of times tonight, that we've got damp and mold action group, which I chair personally, looking at how we align services between health, social services and housing to really ensure we've got priority cases. We've visited, as of last Friday, 266 homes where there has been damp and mold to check and make sure our information is up to date, improving our systems, our management. Damp and mold is categorized into two categories. Category 1 is the most severe, and at the moment we have 0 known cases of category 1 damp and mold in the borough. And in terms of category 2 cases, we brought the number down substantially since the start of the damp and mold action group in about the start of December, from about 431 down to 258. And that's because of this diversified model. We're becoming less reliant on those major contractors, and we've invested more money into smaller firms and also into our DLO, direct labour organisation, where the borough is employing operatives directly, who we control and manage and get out into those cases. So there is some good news on repairs, but like I said, we are transparent and we are realistic, and we know there's more to do.
Thank you very much. Is there more like a comments during our casework and the constant surgeries? The residents are still complaining that subcontractors are the same and they have the same behavior. Even we have the change the contracts, but the same people turning up, the same attitude, same complaints. So we on part of the officer team, we apologise to residents who do face that sort of service. Is not acceptable. We're working hard with contractors in order to enhance their management of subcontractors, and we're doing what we can through looking at the kind of overall model about how we incentivise and penalise contractors working in the council, as well as day-to-day management to get this right. But we do absolutely sympathise and empathise with people who have had delays to their repairs, or the job's not been done right first time. We get about 1,000 repairs a week, so the numbers churning through the council are very, very sizable. Many repairs go well, but we absolutely acknowledge that too many don't.
Thank you, John. I have 2 very quick questions, if you don't mind. My first is really a kind of comment on how crazy cold it was out there today, freezing fog. Lots of residents are worried about turning their heating on. Today was an absolutely appalling day if you're in that situation. I'd just like to ask what we're doing to make council houses more energy efficient. What we're doing to help in that way. And my second question, I'm probably going to look at you, Martin, for this one. In the medium financial plan, there was talk about digital improvements, and I would like to very much know what residents can expect to see as far as housing is concerned. Thank you. Mark? Don't worry, it was mostly directed at Martin.
You're absolutely right. Cost of living, people are worried about being able to pay heating costs. They're going up. They're going up at an alarming rate. What we're doing about the fabric and the buildings themselves. Our asset management team are working closely with the climate change officers and the advice that they're bringing about how we can how we can introduce measures to show impact. We're already targeting our capital program at roofs, insulation, drainage. So there are windows. So there are already things that you'll see coming through in terms of the contracts, that some of which are now on site delivering that work.
Thank you. And that's all, a lot of that work is already accounted for in this budget that we've seen this evening.
Absolutely.
Lovely.
It's been approved, it's been budgeted for. We do think that part of our strategy in the short term, perhaps the next year or two, is to see whether we can accelerate the capital program. And it seems a bit odd to say, in a sort of budget review meeting, that we want to spend more money, because if we can do the right improvement work for our housing stock, we should see a reduction in demand in terms of day-to-day responsive repairs, which could see us save money in the medium term. So, and that's one of the reasons why you'll see in the slides Sukhinder and Danny showed you that there's still ongoing improvement works. There's still works we need to do on damp and mold and disrepair. Getting the capital program accelerated. This will not only make living in our properties more comfortable, but also save us money in terms of reduction in responsive
Yeah,
repairs.
I imagine that the capital work should help create a fire break, if you like, in the damp and mold work. If we're making those homes warmer, then the
Well, those are the very
condensation
technical-
barrier moves back.
Yeah,
Right?
those are the very technical questions which
Yeah,
I won't
sorry.
attempt to answer, but we do have technical bods working in our team, don't we, Martin, that we can explore.
Yeah.
What do you but certainly, on damp and mold, and I don't think we've really brought out the urgency of addressing damp and mold and the risks if we don't, and similarly with disrepair, because of the national focus, the government focus on particularly damp and mold since the really unfortunate tragic case in Rochdale. So there's absolutely no doubt that housing organisations, including local authorities, that don't show and evidence the journey of recovery, if you like, and resolving the cases that we've got, we could be singled out very publicly, in terms of articles in the press, the housing press, but also, it could be about starting to ask questions of the management of the stock in that particular local authority. So the last thing anybody will want to see is an enforced, management intervention of some description, managing the stock that so well, that you influence and shape policy and strategy to ensure we deliver a strong service that's well received. And my final point, and again this is similarly about risk, is that the social housing regulation landscape is changing. It's been strengthened with an increasing focus from April onwards on tenant satisfaction, prescribed measures that we will need to collect and report into the social housing regulator, which will be publicly available and benchmarked with whoever you want, authorities across London, all housing organisations, 10,000 units and more. So actually, you know, what I've been really impressed with is Linda and Danny sort of saying, look, you know, if we drive down and save every penny in the short to medium term, the impact will be that you won't resolve the damp and mold cases that we've got, or disrepair. Our reputation will be shaky, and you know, we'll suffer more compensation cases through disrepair and damp and mold. So it's a kind of be careful what you wish for, because if you cut your cloth too much at a time when we've got to increase our game to each other, to our customers, and to the regulator, if we trim too quickly, we could live to regret it. And you know, you could look back and blame any number of key people over the years, but actually it'll be on our watch in 23, 24. So I think the budget reflects that that balance between risk and opportunity, and things that we've got to get done without depleting our reserves to the point that we're unlawful. So I'd just like to thank my two colleagues on my left. Okay, Martin, we can include you in that, because you throw your eyes in for good measure as well. But there's been a lot of thinking and difficult conversations around where this has been pitched, if you like.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. Martin, I'm sorry to do this to you. Would you mind giving me quite a short conversation? Because we've got Mr. Thurloway.
So I've got a couple of questions when it's convenient, Chair.
I'm really keen to get to the resident question as well. Thank you. Okay, lovely. Martin.
So digital delivery. So our future, what we call in the business target operator model, or the way that we work, is based on a much simplified system, which is fully supported by online service delivery. So we are working to establish a single housing hub for all landlord services, which will be one telephone number. We're not going down the road of progressively switching off our telephone service, but we want to offer, promote, and over managed time, move to online delivery as far as possible. So over the last year, we've been implementing our new housing management system, Northgate. It's lots of technical stuff. That's the foundation for what we can then roll out. We've just successfully put online allocations management, so people can see what properties are available and tell us what they're interested in. From a manual system. We are now starting to look at online repairs management, starting with a safe level and a doable level that we can introduce ideally this year, which will give people an online view of where their repair is at, as well as being able to talk to us online. And then all of the areas of housing, including issues on estate, antisocial behaviour and so on, we're looking to roll out a means to report, request online, do as much as possible. This is not without having access to avoid or keep a level of provision. What we're seeking to do is increase visibility, more officers in and around estates, connecting with residents, working proactively to improve the quality of our estates as well.
So it's all heading towards increased transparency or kind of visibility.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Simpler model, more online, and more visibility and time on estates.
Martin, thank you very much. Councillor Alexander, would you mind keeping them quite brief so that Mr. Fulham can get his question in?
Firstly, just following on from what Councillor Siddiq said earlier, I would like to thank Councillors Ume, Councillors Ree, John, Mark, Savinda, Danny and Martin for the work that they've done here, because it really, it's a colossal task and I don't begin to understand half of it. So my questions are quite small on bits and pieces. We did earlier mention the capitalised value of our housing stock as a figure. I'm interested to know, and this one can come at a later date, I think, because it might be a detailed answer, and as the chair wants us to hurry up a little bit. The ratio of our housing stock is made up from freeholds, which have land values, tenanted properties, leasehold properties, and these ratios do change from time to time, and it's how we see the value. And in some cases, some of our property are seen as liabilities. Therefore, if we dispose of it on lease, it may go up or down, and I'd just like to know how that affects the overall figure in quite broad brush terms rather than in detail. Second question related to the CO2 levels, which are going to severely impact on our programme and the programme costs. If we have, if we're responsible for 75% of the CO2 emissions, as we were told earlier, from our housing stock currently is about 16 to 18,000 properties in a borough with about 80,000 properties. So for easy maths, we'll say about 20% of the borough's property. So we've got 75% of the CO2 outputs against 20% of the properties. How do we begin to calculate that? And how do we take into account issues where you have leaseholders or other sources which you don't control what the CO2 outputs are? And really the central question to this is which properties are responsible for these huge figures? Because we've got some that don't even have gas, and obviously they're at zero. So that figure is even worse when we look at it the other way. So sorry, John, I think Mark might have been better to answer it, but if you can address it, thank you.
So I mean, the first question was the total value, the stock, capital stock, and if units were disposed of, how that would change. Now, I mean, typically the council doesn't dispose of units and is increasing the stock. So, you know, you would expect the capital value of the stock, ceteris paribus, excluding market movement up or down in London prices, to slowly increase over coming years. Second question around CO2 emissions. I mean, we work very closely with colleagues in the Environment Directorate around climate change and around, you know, fabric improvement to our housing stock and issues around boilers. So there's a number of issues here that need to align. One is the borough's ambition for net zero by 2030 for the council's activities. Secondly, you know, value for money, including for leaseholders in terms of interventions. And thirdly, interventions at speed. You know, we've talked about damp and mold and how capital investment in stock can aid that and reduce the number of repairs. So there's a number of different dynamics which we model, and as I said, work closely with environment colleagues on. On your specific question around the relative CO2 emissions of different blocks, I'm afraid offhand I don't know the answer, but we'll be delighted to supply you with a written response.
Thank you. I didn't expect you to give me the exact detail. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you. So Martin Thurloway, we have a resident here who'd like to ask a couple of questions. Mr. Thurloway, you can get a full written response to your questions from officers, but if there's some of your questions that you'd like to expressly put to them now, then please do.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my first question was, is it working? My first question was about not increasing rents to the 7% that regulated says, which you've answered, and I think possibly not satisfactory, but you never mentioned the fact that the rent base will now be lower than it would be for future years. So in future years, if the regulator says 5%, it'll be 5% of a lower amount. And that will be forever or until we get another chancellor, or prime minister or something like that. So the second question was about service charges, which I know from the cabinet report that 3.8 million had been identified. But it's only got 3.5 million increase, but you're saying that some of those have been implemented in the previous years. So it wouldn't be an increase again. No, okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I, so I was going to ask Councillor Ree if you'd like to come in on the question about cabinet decisions.
Yeah, of course. Well, firstly, thank you very much, Mr. Thirlway, for coming in and asking these questions. It's good to know that somebody reads all these papers that we put out there. So thank you very much. In terms of your first question on lowering the rental base, yeah, that's absolutely right. But it does go back to what I said earlier, that all these, the rental policy that we set, we then expect residents to have to pay. So yeah, that means that residents will not have to be, if we did decide to put up rent by the maximum amount next year, they would be paying less than if we'd put it up this year. So as I say, we are always considering value for money and the cost of living when it comes to making these decisions, and that's something we're very conscious of.
Thank you. Sukhvinder, would you like to?
Yes, I can pick up perhaps a second question.
Thank you.
So you're absolutely right that some of the income was reflected in last year's accounts, 22-23, and therefore that was already collected. So part of it will go to this year, and this year we're increasing the service charges to cover the inflationary pressures.
Yeah. So we're now getting service charges that, well, I think service charges to leaseholders and tenants should be the same, apart from identifiable things like insurance is the biggest one. Right. And they're all in accordance with the Landlord and Tenant Act. Section,
and we're already recovering
19, I think, if I remember rightly. Reasonably incurred and a reasonable standard of work. Yeah. Next question was about the increase in capital charges of 11.5%. So what is included in that? And also corporate charges, which has gone up 8.6%. I know that all the other departments will see a reserve, they call the HRA reserve, and think they can get their hands on it, and they can't. but that doesn't stop them thinking and trying. And one of the ways they do is to increase this thing called corporate charges.
Hi, thank you for your questions. I think I can answer the one about capital charges and the increase in the capital charges budget. So capital charges is constituted rather simply of pretty much only two things. One of them is the depreciation charge in the HRA. The depreciation charge in the HRA is around 17 million each year. The depreciation charge in the HRA is a contribution to the cost of our investment in the capital. So it's you can think of it rather like a revenue contribution from the HRA into or towards the cost of capital improvements in the stock. The other element of capital charges is the interest that we have to pay on our borrowings. And I think I might have mentioned that earlier. I said it was about 8 million is our current spend, and obviously that's anticipated to increase because of increases in interest rates, but also because of the fact that we're increasing the amount of overall borrowing that we're going to be doing in the HRA. So those are the two main ingredients.
And if I just cover the second point about the corporate charges, Mr. Thurlowey, you'll know that the inflation levels have been considerably higher across the year, 11–12%. We are trying to protect the HRA as much as possible, wherever we can. We're trying to make efficiencies that Martin and colleagues have talked about to make sure that there is value for money in the HRA. So we've minimized the impact of the increase in the corporate charges to about the 8.6% that you've talked about earlier. But we continue to review all those costs and all the expenditure to make sure that that continues to be the absolute minimum without compromising the services that we provide to our residents.
Thank you very much.
There was, I was going to say, and this is my opinion, that you should never ever budget for a deficit, regardless of how big your reserves are, because reserves are a one-off. Once they're spent, you can't spend them. You can't spend them next year and the year after and the year after that. So regardless of how big they are, they shouldn't be used. And
I think, Chair, through you, just to emphasize that point, that's absolutely right. And that's why we've done the hard work that we've done to reduce that deficit from the 4.1 million to the current number. We would have liked to have come to the committee here and to the council to see that the position is balanced overall, but there are some pressures and we're putting in temporary resources and reserves to deal with that. We are hoping that next time this year, when we look at the HRA budget, we'll be on a balanced position overall, which is what we want to do.
Yeah. Well, again, it's my opinion. I don't think the reserves are excessive at all. I've seen much bigger reserves than that. And so, yes, I think Councillor Alford mentioned something about, are we going to end up with another mid-year rent increase in a panic, which is what it was. And overall, it wouldn't, whether it, having the deficit is not in accordance with your item in the strategy. It says maintain the financial resilience of the HRA. Budgeting for a deficit just doesn't do it.
Because if I may come back on that, I mean, I think Councillor Reid's been absolutely crystal clear. There will not be a second rent rise in this coming financial year. But secondly, Mark Lovian, the Interim Director of Housing Transformation, talked eloquently earlier about the need to upstream costs. So we need to spend in order to improve the repair service, and we talked about the repair service earlier, and other facets of things that are upstream in what we spend. Otherwise, the council will continue to spend on residual downstream amounts, disrepair cases, legal cases, moving people, malorganization. So by improving the stock, improving the repair service, you cut out a lot of costs, and in the longer term, you'll have a more effective and cost-efficient housing service.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Mr. Thurloway. So I think we're coming to the end of the meeting. Can I just check, do committee members agree to note the housing revenue account budget for 22-23? 23-24? Yeah, for 23-24. Agreed? Lovely. All right. So I think that we've kind of agreed that we want to look more at, well, for a start, the definition of thermal efficiency, but I think there's definitely an area around greening housing stock that we could certainly look at. I think the committee is really keen to look at new build developments as well, and we'll look at the agendas and see when we can bring that in. Councillor Umeh?
Hi, Chair. Thank you so very much. I just wanted to also just, if I may, just offer my thanks to Mr. Thirlaway for coming in and for sharing these really important questions. I think, yeah, just obviously as the Cabinet Member for Housing and Homelessness, I also wanted to pass my thanks on to Councillor Ree and the officers for the work that's been done to prepare the budget for this evening's discussion. I think there have been a load of challenging decisions that have had to be made over the past 6 months plus. In particular, Mr. Thirlaway made the point with regards to the second rent increase. And I know this comment's obviously been, the response has been given both by John and by Councillor Ree. And I would just sort of add that, you know, this council, like many other councils, is operating in such an incredibly challenging and volatile economic environment. And I think the picture that this council saw at the start of last year was very different to the end of last year. And so tough decisions have had to be made. And I really appreciate all the questions that have been raised and discussed in the committee this evening. I think the planned programme, as you've mentioned, will be a very helpful discussion at a future PAC meeting, because there is a dedication and commitment to make that investment in housing that this council has not seen before. I mean, it's a record amount of investment in the housing stock, which has for many years not seen that level of investment before under previous administration. So I think it's going to be a really important area to emphasise and explore and discuss what that programme looks like for the future of the housing stock. But in addition to that, the work that's being done to tackle the repairs programme as well will be really, really important to be discussed at the committee. So thank you for the opportunity and thank you for the comments and questions from this evening.
Thank you, Councillor Ume. I would just like to say, well, that we are in tempestuous times and realise the solid amount of work that has to go into trying to pin down a budget when everything is shifting under our feet quite so much. I'd like to echo the thanks from Councillor Ume, Councillor Ree, Councillor Alexander. We really do appreciate the work that's gone in and the very clear and informative reports that have been brought to the PAC this time. I'd like to thank the members actually for quite comprehensive questions, and thank you for all of those answers. It's been a really informative session. Our next meeting, if committee members would mind noting, is the 20th of March. Thank you so much to everybody here and to anybody who sat through and watched us on YouTube this evening. Thank you very much and good evening.
Thank you.